It's showtime. We are here, Just One Byte, our virtual cybersecurity event. I'm your host, Jonathan Otero. I'm really excited to be with you guys today. And in conjunction with Uniti Fiber, we are putting this event on. I've got some special guests. As you guys seen, I've been promoting this. So now you're going to get a chance to speak to them directly. I'm going to kick it off, though, because I know these guys and I want to start talking about some real interesting topics. So as you guys hop on the live, whether you're on LinkedIn joining us, welcome. If you're on YouTube, welcome. All you have to do is post your comments in the chat. As we go along here, we're going to bring those comments up. So stay tuned. I'm going to kick off the event right now by introducing our special guests. So first of all, let me bring them up here and let me tell you a little bit about them. Craig Phillippe, who's the EVP of Information Assurance for Principia RAID. Super excited to have him on. You may remember, if you follow me, that I had him on as a guest on the podcast last summer. Craig's top skills include cybersecurity law, cybersecurity, cyber investigations. This guy has a wealth of knowledge, starting his own company last year with one of our other guests I'm introduce you to, an adjunct professor formerly at the George Washington University, and over 20 years of experience at the FBI, with his last role being a cybersecurity attorney and counsel, supervisory special agent for the cyber law unit. So boom, there you go. There's one. Hello, Craig. How are you?
Good, Jonathan. Great to be here. Thanks for having me again.
Awesome stuff. And let me introduce his partner and co-founder. Look at this. Look at what Jeff's got going on here. What is going on over there? Jeff isn't too much. Jeff Roberts is also the EVP of Information Services at Principia RAID, co-founder, top skills IT strategy, leadership IT governance. I spoke to Jeff when he was at his last company. He held many roles in IT. He was the VP of IT at that time for Cobham, and now he's co-founded Principia RAID with Craig. Welcome, Jeff, to the show.
Thank you, sir. Looking forward to it.
Super excited to be chatting with you again. And last but not least, Lee Bailey, Director of Information Security and Compliance at Tupperware Brands. Lee his top skills are IT security operations, service delivery, IT security best practices. He's made a couple publications. One is the cybersecurity part of your customer service policy and tenable economic, operational, and strategic benefits of security framework and adoption. He's an adjunct professor at Valencia College as well. Lee, welcome as well.
Thank you very much.
I'm so excited to have you guys here. And here we all are. Look at that. Our crew is here. So listen, we're having people jumping on the live right now, and they're jumping on the different links. So as they're jumping on, I want to kick off the show. And by the way, guys, as you see in the chat, I posted the link to the YouTube. If you're on our LinkedIn right now, obviously you're here, so that's great. But if you want to join us with the YouTube link, you can do that as well. Post your questions in the chat. And here's how I want to get started, guys. So listen, obviously, when I had this idea, we were talking, it's been some time has passed and everything's been going on with the pandemic. And I think that cybersecurity kind of fell off, but I'm seeing a trend in 2021 where spikes are on the rise of attacks, right? Most notably, it was almost like they knew that this was coming, because just recently, what was it, March 11th, Coors Beverage Company had an attack. It was in the news. It made headlines all over the place. High profile attacks are very, very common right now. And these attackers are realizing the profitability in getting these ransomware attacks. It was announced, they shut down some systems. And for those guys who love Coors Beverage, they must have been going crazy. Like, what's going on, right? They can't get their favorite drink. I'm a Stella guy, by the way, so I was okay. But the point is that, all these attacks are on the rise with ransomware. So let me kick it off like this. Let me start it off with you, with Jeff. Jeff, I'm curious to know, from being in your perspective, being in your seat with your organization and your clients, what are you seeing is 2021? Are you seeing a huge spike in terms of these high profile attacks with your organizations? And if so, what are some of the steps that we can talk about to kind of mitigate that going forward?
Yeah, thanks for that context, Jonathan, and let's jump right in. I'm joining here from the cybersecurity couch just outside of Orlando, Florida, and want to welcome everybody to the session. Looking forward to getting some good Q&A as we get going, but that's a great way to start it, Jonathan. What we are seeing pretty much across our entire client base is, as you indicated, the Coors Molson attack is actually a really good example of things that are in the news. But that's just one of many that have been happening. I think it's correct that with more remote workers, with more people working from home during the pandemic, there's a host of bad actors, some nation states, some cyber criminals that have taken this opportunity to probe at some new sets of vulnerabilities and some long-time existing sets of vulnerabilities. The other one that you'll see at the moment that's really prevalent in the news is related to some recent Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities. Exchange is the largest messaging platform in the world, used by everything from multi-billion-dollar enterprise down to small mom and pops. So basically, along with the Coors Molson example of ransomware, there are massively used systems that have recently exploited vulnerabilities. And this is a rabbit hole that we could spend the whole hour talking about. But to hit the highlights, the basics haven't changed as far as how you protect against those vulnerabilities. It's stay on top of your patching. Make sure you are updating, live exploits when they are announced. Don't wait 2 months. Don't wait a week in some cases, depending on the severity of the vulnerabilities. The challenge was something as broad as the recent Microsoft Exchange one that impacts, again, everything from multi-billion-dollar global aerospace down to the mom and pops, is a lot of companies that rely on some of these tools don't necessarily have their own security operations center or their own security team. And in some cases, they don't have a CISO. It's one of the services that we provide at Principia RAID to companies that need that level of oversight. So I would bring it back to stay on top of the basics, do your patching, and you will, ideally avoid many of these bad actors. But I can't stress how important it is to stay as aware as you can. And if you don't have the service in-house, it's probably worth thinking about retaining some experts to help. Lee, Craig, any comment on that one? I know that's a big one at the moment that we've probably all struggled with.
Go ahead, Craig.
So
I'll go
whichever
last.
one.
Yeah. So,
Go ahead,
Lee, go ahead.
Oh, sure. Thank you. So from my perspective, I love what you're saying. I love what you're saying about the basics. I have this philosophy of, focusing on the basics. John Wooden, I'm not a huge basketball fan, but he's a basketball coach. And he would start every season off coaching his players by sitting them down and making them learn how to tie their shoes and put their shoes and socks on correctly. And when a player might get a little upset about that, he would say, well, if you're not going to learn to do the basics, then you don't need to be on my team. And the reason for that is that if you don't put your shoes and socks on properly and lace them up properly, then you're going to wind up getting blisters. If you get blisters, then you can't practice properly. If you don't practice properly, you won't learn how to do your plays properly. And then if you can't do your plays properly, you won't win games. If you can't win games, you can't win championships. So I really love that analogy of just going back and doing the basics. And it's also that analogy of not being the slowest guy or gal, not being the one that's going to be the most picked up by the bear. And you just have to outrun everybody behind you. And so do that. Do exactly what these guys are saying and focus on those fundamentals.
Awesome. What do you got to say, Craig?
Yeah, it was a really interesting experience, a hack, right? So it kind of brought it home to everyone. Not everyone cares about ransomware. Not everyone cares about cybersecurity, but you really impact the beer manufacturing facility for a prolonged period of time, and people take note, right? And well, they should, right? But in keeping with the fundamentals, part of the prevention as well is preparing for it, right? Even with the best prevention, they still might slip through. You may actually catch a bad case of ransomware. You've got to prepare for that in advance, right? You've got to do those backups. You've got to do the patching, as Jeff and Lee said. The fundamentals are so important.
So let me ask you guys this question, right? And here's my analogy of it. And I'm not as technical as you guys are, right? My technical aspect is, for me, a hard drive is the i4 during rush hour. That's a hard drive, right? That's how my technical aspect is. But to put it in context of like sports, and Craig, I know that you're a big football guy. You like the Baltimore Ravens, right? That's your team. I say that it's almost like the Jets going against like the Chiefs, right? We have no shot. It's like almost like these hackers they have such a step up. It almost seems like they're 2-3 steps ahead of us. And we know, kind of the basics, right? We talked about, Craig, even on our episode last summer about MFA, multi-factor authentication. So can you elaborate a little bit more about kind of those basic steps that companies should be using to just kind of mitigate the risk? Now, before you even answer that, Craig, and I'm going to bring you up here, I'm noticing we're having a bunch of people jumping on both links on YouTube and on LinkedIn. Thank you guys for joining. If you have any questions for these guys as we're going on, just a reminder to post those comments in the comments section there so we can ask them. But go ahead, Craig. What do you think about that?
Sure, man. And so you mentioned multi-factor, and that is one of the most basic things you can do to really mitigate risk from some type of compromise, right? Multi-factor, one of my favorite things to talk about, is what it does primarily is prevent remote account takeover in case your password is exposed, right? All passwords are getting will get compromised at some time or another, right? And people are, unfortunately, and everyone does it. You use the same passwords across different accounts. So if your favorite online store gets compromised and your password is exposed, for that particular account, there's a chance that some of your other accounts are now exposed as well. What multi-factor does is, even if somebody has your password, they still need an additional physical token. Now, there's different flavors of multi-factor. And we've talked about this in some of Principia does a cybersecurity minute, and we've talked about multi-factor on one of those, right? There's different flavors of multi-factor, of what those factors are. It's something something you have, and something you are. And something you have, I actually have one right here, is just a tiny hardware token. You can use it, goes right into your iPhone or Lightning connector, or it goes into a USB-C connector, and you type in your password and you just touch it, and that's your extra factor, right? Even if the bad guy has your password, they're not going to have that physical token. That is a super simple thing. You can get one of those on Amazon now. They're routinely available to the consumer, and even your banks and your online retailers will offer a one-time passcode when you log in. They'll send you an SMS message with a special code. Right. So if the bad guy has your password, they can't get in without also having your phone. Right. And if they have your phone, then you've got bigger problems. But at least that's preventing remote account takeover. And it's a huge safety measure, and so important to security. Right. And it's so basic, and everyone can do it now. So that would be one of the more basic things that even rookie or novice cybersecurity folk we always suggest is one of the first things you implement.
And I appreciate you saying that, guys, because at least folks should know that. But I'm sure you guys know in your field, you'd be surprised how many people don't do it. So, Lee, I want to ask you this question. I'm curious to know from your perspective and in your seat. I think some of the two biggest cybersecurity fears that you may have sitting in your position, the two biggest fears, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, is everyone who works at the company and everyone who doesn't. Those should be your two fears, right? Now, let me ask you this, though. You can put in all these security measures in place for your organization. Tupperware Brands is a big brand, global companies, it's a huge company. You can have all the security measures in place. You could have all the policies in place. Sometimes you could even have maybe too much security. We're going to get into that in a second. But my question is, what happens when you have the employee who says, you know what, I'm going to download a SaaS service outside of what, our policies are. Let's say they need like an Adobe, converter or something like that. So they download this SaaS service, and they're downloading some customer information, some really private data that the organization has. How do you prevent something like that from happening externally? They're logged into the VPN, let's say, and something happens, and now boom, you're compromised. How I'm sure that keeps you up at night. What do you do from your organization?
I think we've hit on several of those items so far. So first off is train. Make sure that we're training our people what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do, and train them on the right thing to do. Make sure they have tools so that they know how to do what they need to do. Because the worst thing is we go through and we have a job to do and we're trying to get it done, and it seems like security is just blocking us. We don't need security to be a blocker. We need security to help us find the right ways to make things happen. So make sure people are trained, they know what's right, they know what's wrong, and then they know how to do what's right. And also they know how to report what's wrong. So if they see someone sees somebody doing something wrong, make sure they know how to report it as well. and track and reward as much as possible along that line. From a technical perspective, you've already hit on the process piece. From a technical perspective, there are definitely tools out there to block the download of software, whether it's you can't get to this bad site by some kind of web filtering that you have either through open DNS, maybe even on your home device, your home router, or you provide or sign up for some type of subscription service. Maybe it's a Cisco, maybe it's a Proofpoint, whatever that is. You go through and you sign up for that service to block, to keep you from going where you don't need to be going. And then if someone actually does download that they're at least warned. If not, that file type is actively blocked by some type of endpoint protection. And then sometimes these endpoint protection tools also have the capability to go through and help you respond if something bad is downloaded onto your system. And that EDR type capability is super helpful to respond in a timely manner. Now, if it's not a matter of badness getting onto your computer, it's just a matter of data being there. There are other tool sets that are known as DLP, data loss prevention tool sets. And those data loss prevention tool sets help you to identify where the data is at in your environment or in your cloud environments or in those networks that are coming into your systems. And with that DLP software, you can identify what's coming in and even potentially block it from coming in or leaving. And that can be super important if you're subject to privacy regulations, whether it's CCPA in the US or Virginia now has a new privacy law, or if you're a multinational company and you have to deal with LGBT down in Brazil, GDPR in EU, IPO over in South Africa, and all these privacy laws coming up, giving us some more things to think about when it comes to making sure we're doing our due diligence, our basic minimum requirements to protect our customers' data and to make sure that we are a trustworthy organization.
Very interesting. I'm sure a lot of people were curious to see how, from someone that sits at your level at Tupperware, I'm sure they're probably curious to know what you guys were doing. So I appreciate you sharing that. Now, but it leads me to think, we can put all these security, policies in place, but I'm going to ask this question to Jeff. I'm curious. I think this is a dumb question, but I'm going to ask it. Is it possible that a company can have too much security policies in place? Like with Lee, where you have these blocks where people can't go on certain websites, right? But then they find the workaround somehow, some way. So is it possible to have too much security, or is that just something totally dumb?
No, it's not a dumb question at all. This is this entire area. There aren't any dumb questions, right? And frankly, that's a really good example of a question that comes up all the time. It's one that we are dealing with at the moment with a client who has recently been acquired. So, company gets divested, somebody else buys the company. And at the moment, the new owner of this company has come in to a situation where they are typically not the kind of company that would have all kinds of security tools. And they've come into this company that does. And they're going, what is all this about? Why are you guys doing this? This seems incredibly inconvenient for our users compared to the way we know to do things. And you have to ask, why is the security there? What is mandating it? And just for some context, the majority of my experience is in the aerospace and defense arena, and things do work a little bit differently there, specifically because the cybersecurity and the information data protection is key to those companies being able to do business with government agencies, et cetera. So, in many cases, you've got to ask, why is the security there? Why is it required? And is it mandated? And in many of these types of organizations, the answer to, why do you have to do all these things comes down to, it's a contractual obligation. If you want to do business with the government or with the government supply chain, that ecosystem has changed dramatically to the point that companies are now effectively mandated to prove that you are compliant with a very long list of cybersecurity hygiene issues. But to your point, the question still comes up. And, even coming out of aerospace, our mandate number one was don't break the business. So simply because you are required to have a certain tool in place or track a certain type of data, or to Lee's point, use DLP to be able to mark and classify and protect data, mission number one is still don't break the business, because at the end of the day, if you make it so inconvenient for your user experience, engineers aren't going to want to work for your company. If you make the user experience so difficult that it just becomes painful, you're going to find that insider threat becomes a bigger issue because people will find ways to get around what they view as inconvenient. So the answer to the question is there is such a thing as the perception of too much security. I personally don't believe that there is too much security. I think the problem is there's really not enough security, but the way that those tools are implemented can be done so much more practically with much better focus on the user experience. So I think the key is don't just say, no, we don't need those tools. It's inconvenient. You do need the tools. The reason that there are so many breaches today is so many companies have been ignoring the basics of cyber hygiene for years. So it's not you don't need the tools, it's you need to work with someone who can help you implement those tools in a way that won't make the user experience terrible, and it can be done. It's not always easy, but it can absolutely be done. And the other thing, frankly, Jonathan, to your point earlier about all of the news and all of the breaches and all of the ransomware and all of the vulnerabilities, we like to look at what's the good news? Where's the opportunity? Well, the opportunity is that security and cybersecurity used to be viewed as, I got a bunch of nerds over there in the server room, they're dealing with the problem. The challenge now is that has been elevated because it's in the news and it is so impactful. One of the things that we always try to do is this is not just a technical problem. This is a business problem. And the fact that it's become such a bigger issue today is now elevating it to the C-level, because that's really where it needs to be discussed and embraced and understood. It's a C-level problem. This is no longer just, I got a bunch of nerds over there that are going to make it that we're good. That's not how it works anymore. So I think all of this comes together. The perception that you do need the tools, the reality that you've got to deliver a good user experience for the tools to be used the way they're meant to be used. And it's a problem that needs to be embraced at the highest levels of business, not just in IT.
You hit on a lot of things, Jeff, that I want to touch on because so we were talking about the employee and tools, right? So I'm curious to know this. Let's talk about, and you mentioned cyber hygiene. We already talked about multi-factor. Let me ask you this question, Craig. I'm going to tee this up for you. I'm curious to know from your background and your experience, one of the tools that is in place is you can purchase cybersecurity insurance, right? This is something that I've looked at before in the past. I've spoken to a couple of your peers and when we had conversations and meetings, but are most cybersecurity insurance policies appropriate from what you see in the industry? How do you shop around for that type of insurance? Is that something that people should even look at?
Sure. Well, cyber insurance does exactly what it says, right? It protects you against the damages that might come from being compromised. And it's the same theory, right? It's ultimately a business decision. It's a risk analysis. It's the same decision you make, when you get car insurance, right? Every day you get in the car, and there's going to be accidents out there. You hope it's not going to be you, but somebody's going to get hit, and that's why there's insurance. And cyber insurance is essentially the same thing. And much like driving a car, someone's going to get compromised on any given day. And again, you hope your preparations, you put on your figurative seatbelt, you enable those security measures, and you hope you limit the damages if you do get in that accident, right? What we are seeing with cyber insurance, interestingly, is the insurance companies, their appetite is actually getting much lower. So not only are security measures necessary to run your business, right? You want to have good cybersecurity. You want to protect your IP. You want to protect your employees. It's also becoming a gate to getting cyber insurance itself, right? So if you don't have good policies and procedures and measures and tools in place, you might not be able to get the cyber insurance. And you're certainly more likely to be a victim, so you would actually need the insurance more. So insurance, it depends on what your risk appetite is as a business. It's certainly likely that you may experience a compromise. Whether it be a large one or a small one as a company, you're going to be targeted in some way, whether by design, somebody actually targeting your IP, or whether by opportunity, somebody sees an opening and a vulnerability that hasn't been patched, you will experience a compromise. So do you want to be insured for that? Is it worth it paying the premiums, to protect you or get that recompense when it happens? Ultimately, it's definitely worth looking into and definitely worth investigating what the cost would be for your specific company. But again, it's a personal decision. How much, what are your coverages for your car insurance? It's the same analysis that happens for cyber insurance for a company.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it comes down to, this is the thing, right? What's the ROI? That's what it always comes down to, right? I have these conversations with your peers all the time. Some of them are on the live right now. Hello, guys. If you know me, and we've had meetings in your office, we know what it is, right? You want to get these stuff. You can have the best tools in the market. You could have the best plan. And then you go into the CFO's office and you say, this is what we need. And they're going to be like, and there's no way that we're going to put a budget together for that, right? There's no ROI. So let me ask you this question, Lee, because I see you shaking your head. Yes, you're nodding. I don't want you to throw your CFO under the bus, but I will tell you this. I'm curious to know, some companies just look at the return on investment. What is this? When it comes down to investing in cybersecurity, they weigh the risk versus the ROI and they say yes or no based on that. So what do you think? What's the problem with that strategy? How can the IT person who's sitting right now watching us talk, right? They're sitting there in their homes, in their offices, whatever. They're saying, I got these wonderful ideas, but I know it's going to get shot down when I, put it up, send it up the ladder. How do you balance that from your perspective, the risk versus reward, the ROI, and get those approved?
I'm not going to throw a CFO under the bus. I'm going to go through an elevated CFO. So when I was working over at ABC Finance Spirits, I had a great CFO who taught me how to make a business case. And that's one thing that in IT, we tend to do a very poor job of, is learning how to talk in the language of the business. And so to go back, is there such a thing as too much security? Sure there is. What's the most secure system? One that's turned off and unplugged from the network. Is it functional? No. And so we have to figure out how to go through and to meet that nice sweet spot of it. But that just completely reinforces exactly what was being said. Find that sweet spot of how to go through and enable the business to do what it needs to do in a trustworthy way, so that the users still do what they need to do. Our associates, our team members still work. Part of that business case is understanding what drives the business. And I find that there are partners in the business who can help me with that. Sometimes they're in operations, sometimes they're in marketing, sometimes they're in legal, sometimes they're in accounting. But find those partners, those who you can relate with, develop a relationship with. And I find that legal is frequently one of those partners that I can go to and say, okay, we're both kind of risk averse. We both are trying to find ways to identify and mitigate risk. And so if I can develop that relationship with legal, I get a good pulse on what the risk culture is in the company, and then how to start articulating that. And it also helps me to understand some of the compliancy issues we're trying to deal with, because one of the ways we tend to get hung up in IT, as I came up with IT ranks, was, hey, this is cool, this is really great, it's going to do some great things for us. But then reframing that conversation to the technical problem it solves, or the business problem it solves, the business problem it solves is very important. And that's where compliancy, whether it's regulatory compliance, or whether you're thinking about GDPR, privacy, whether you're thinking about contractual compliance, PCI, whenever we start having those conversations around, okay, here's what our business is responsible to comply with, here are the tools that need to be there in order to be compliant, or not just tools, people, processes, technology, that full picture of what needs to be there. And then we start building that business case to make it make sense. And so it's changing our language, and it's learning. I love I can't remember the Eric, one of the virtual CISOs out there. He's talking about how being a CISO is not a technical position. It's learning the business and then figuring out how to help the business solve their problems. And then we have the technical guys and gals who are figuring out how to make those dreams a reality. If you want to call it that.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I love it, because I think that a lot of IT professionals, they now have a seat at the table, right? The one thing this came to light was that the IT department is more critical than anything else, almost as any other function in any other department in the business. And now you guys have a seat at the table where your suggestions are going to be impacting the business, and you're adding tremendous business value by making these suggestions, is what I'm starting to see. And, you know, Jeff, I'm just curious to know, you know, going back to you, because you touched on a lot of things the last time you spoke about employees and all that. You know, when we talk about seeing, and even in your past, I want, you know, with what you guys are doing now and in your past, you start to see a lot of these leaders start to emerge because they're coming to the table with some of these great suggestions. So how does an IT staff, an IT department start to kind of, you know, because I'm sure that a lot of these guys are going to become superstars and they're going to be taken away from, and it looks like we might have just lost Lee for, oh, you're back. Okay. Some of those folks might be taken away from other organizations. So how do we keep that talent in-house? And before you answer that, Jeff, I'm curious to know, there's a lot of folks that are on the live right now jumping on. If you guys have any questions for Jeff, Craig, or Lee, just post them in the chat, and we're going to get to the Q&A section shortly. So do that. But Jeff, curious to know, how do we keep these IT leaders who are rock stars in our organization? How do we keep them and not get them stolen from some other organization?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jonathan. And, you know, this is one where there's reality and there's perception, and the truth is very much in the middle, right? Everybody wants to have a fun job. Everybody wants to work in an organization that's growing. Everybody wants to work for a good boss. Everybody wants to feel motivated every day when they go to work. So, you know, ideally, you should do what you're passionate about. And most of the significantly talented individuals that I've been lucky to, you know, work with in my 20+ years in this industry are doing it because they're passionate about what they're doing, right? They're there to deliver value. They enjoy the technology. But to actually touch on what Lee was saying, the transition from technology into business is a big piece of this. You talked about rock stars emerging. Well, frequently what we see is the technical skills are ones that I don't at all mean to minimize. They're incredibly important. But, right, it's a skill. Everybody can learn it. You practice it, you get better at it. The bit that becomes difficult is finding the pieces of talent that can then elevate beyond the technical skill set and maybe step through the management chain to the point where they can earn that seat at the table and earn that voice. And just my own experience, those are the folks that you want to elevate, because they will become the leaders you need to not only fix your technical problems and help manage that technical team, but to increase the voice of cybersecurity and information security, and frankly, IT as a strategy. Coming back to the pandemic challenge, and again, Jonathan, your point, a lot of these people that didn't previously necessarily have a seat at the big table, they now have a seat at the big table, right? Because they were the guy or gal who figured out how to fix the problem to get everybody working from home immediately, who figured out how to deploy some of the remote communication tools to allow their businesses to keep business running during this incredibly challenging time. So recognizing those folks and ensuring that they are appropriately motivated and frankly, appropriately compensated is absolutely key to retaining the talent. The environment that we work in changes every single day. If you find it boring, you are in the wrong field. There's always something to learn. There's always an opportunity to improve your skills. But the bigger challenge is the opportunity to improve your understanding of the business. If you want to be successful, if you want to be recognized as a rock star, you need to understand the business. If you work for a furniture company, you need to understand the business of selling furniture. That's how you're going to deliver value to that executive team, is by understanding the business. If you work for a software as a service provider, you need to spend some time with the sales team understanding your customer base and what they want to achieve by using your tool. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. You can be working in IT and doing relatively the same technical job, but it's that key understanding of what is the business, where are the pain points, what value do you deliver, and what can you do as a member of the IT team to actually help your company differentiate itself. That's how you become a leader. And frankly, that's how you motivate your teams. I couldn't agree more with what Lee said. It's less about the technical side and more about that transition into understanding the business that will both provide motivation to your team and retain the talent that you need to keep the wheels on your bus.
I love that. And one of the things you mentioned, Jeff, that I wanted to really touch on because it was very critical. I think, and I made a joke about it with Lee earlier, where we talk about the two biggest fears are the people that work for the company and the people that don't. But I think that as we continue to keep security top of mind, you mentioned employees earlier, and Lee, I'll actually tee this up for you. How do we keep, because you mentioned it as well, how do we keep security top of mind for the employees? Because it was mentioned earlier that it could be, could get a little bit, I think Jeff said it could get too much for them, right? And they kind of zone out. So how do you keep security top of mind from the employee's perspective?
I like the approach of, number one, finding partners who help me solve the problem. And if you have a partner who helps you with training, then reach out to the partner and say, hey, what are your best practices for making that happen? Especially in the organization that you have. Now, in the organization that I'm a part of, what are those best practices? One is a regular training, whether that's monthly, whether that's quarterly, some kind of consistent regular training to help that employee be better with security and also elevates security and what it can do. Number two, make sure that you reward good behavior. So whether it's just a pat in the back or calling somebody or just encouraging people as you walk through, being a positive person means a lot. I keep my Darth Vader hat nearby, and the reason why I keep my Darth Vader hat nearby is because most people think of security as Darth Vader. No, you can't do that. I mean, that's typically how people think about security. So if we can change that perspective within our companies so that people see security and they think, yes, we can do this as a way to do it safely, to protect my information, to protect my coworkers' information, to protect my customers' information, and if you're publicly traded, our shareholders' information, that it's a win because now we trust each other. Now we know why we're doing these things. So regular education, positive reinforcement, and that just goes a long way to helping people understand the value of security and why it's good for them. And even better is if we can go through and teach them how to be secure at home, teach them how to go through and protect their home Wi-Fi, teach them to go through and what do you look for on your home email to make sure that you're not clicking on something bad and surrendering your personal credit card or your personal bank account information. Make sure that it's a transferable skill that's relevant for them. And all those pieces help to make it so people know that it's helpful and it matters. And one of the things that I consistently do with the security and even the IT team is I'm at the point now where I don't have my hands on the keyboard anymore. And so I constantly remind them, and partly for me too, is to go through and say, hey, thank you. Thank you for everything that you do. To the executive team, thank you for supporting us. And thank you, because you are the ones making this happen, whether it's the executive team funding it, whether it's the people with the boots on the ground doing it, or whether it's our associates and team members reinforcing it, reporting goodness and badness. Everybody else makes it happen. I'm just an orchestrator. They're the ones making the beautiful music, and reward that.
I love it. So guys, we're 40 minutes in. We're only got 20 minutes left with these gentlemen. So we got a couple questions. I'm going to turn it over to some of the audience now. And for those of you who are watching on the lives, whether it's LinkedIn or YouTube, feel free to just post your questions in the comment sections. We can answer those live. Also, you can put it in the chat in our LinkedIn chat that we got going on. As a matter of fact, guys, I'll show you this real quick. We do have a question. I'm going to tee it up for Craig, but I want everybody to kind of just jump in as well. So let me show you this right now. Give me one quick second. Let me pull it up. Do you guys see this here? Let me see. There it is. There's my screen. And do you guys see Jonathan's question there in the chat?
I see the question. Is it better?
So right here, which is better for a company to have an internal SOC department or an outsourced SOC services, and why?
All right, I'm gonna try and avoid giving the lawyerly answers of why it depends. Both are great solutions. They solve kind of different types of problems. An internal SOC team is a pretty major human and IT capital expenditure, right? You've got to keep folk in the seats around the clock, or at very least have an on-call that will inevitably lead to, you know, how much are you going to pay the SOC folk for being on call? Does the person with the pager, I'm really showing my age there, does the person with the cell phone get paid for carrying the cell phone around that's going to get called, right? There's a lot of expenses there, but it's nice to have in-house people that are familiar with all your tools, familiar with your employees, right? There is a certain value in that. Outsourced SOC can be equally as effective. You don't have to pay for the manpower to actually, you know, sit in the seats. There's somebody always there, and they do become familiar with your company. Traditionally, outsourced SOCs have dedicated technicians on their sites that handle your particular company. So there is a degree of familiarity that comes up. If I had an infinite amount of resources, I would go with an in-house SOC, right? I just like having I like having members of my own team that are actually there and work for the company and only work, you know, for me and my company, making it more secure. Outsourced SOCs, of course, have different clients. There's very rarely issues with, you know, dedication or response time. You obviously have established SLAs there. But again, it depends on your available resources. If I had my druthers, I'd go in-house. But outside SOCs are very effective and a good solution. If you're not a big company yet, if you don't have a huge budget for your security practices, they're a great solution.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in with a couple comments there to Jonathan, if you don't mind. So to Craig's point, you know, having one, right? Have one. Start by having one. That's a great solution. Internal versus external, you know, we've built both. And I think often I would agree with Craig that I would rather have an in-house team, but that is typically revenue and cost driven. It's usually a business decision. Going back to Lee's point earlier about ROI, I think everybody would prefer to have their own team of warm bodies in their company running their SOC, but that can become cost prohibitive when you're a business that is just looking at standing that up for the first time. It can often be much more cost effective to outsource it to a reliable provider, and not necessarily one of the big shops. There's all kinds of small to medium enterprise level business services that can absolutely provide the service on an outsourced basis, 24/7 response, and frankly, do just as good a job as what you would do internally for potentially a much lower cost. So, I mean, that is really, it is very much an it depends question. If your budget is unlimited, absolutely build the in-house function. But if you are concerned about what this is going to cost you and what risk it's going to mitigate, it's frequently math.
You know, and Lee, do you want to chime in on that as well?
Sure. I'm going to go through and echo and I'm going to go through and take it one more. I think the answer to this question, like any others, like adult diapers, it depends, right? So as you go through and you think about the situation, for most small, medium-sized businesses, a SOC probably won't make sense. It agreed 100%. It is a business decision if you need to do that. If there's a secret sauce that having a SOC help you to reinforce, then fantastic, go down having an internal SOC. But if having a SOC and having that white glove approach to incident response isn't required for your company, then you go ahead and outsource it, and you can probably do it in a more cost-effective way, definitely with a lot less churn. In my experience doing it both ways, having an internal SOC, you go through, you have an analyst, and if you can't keep a growth path, you're going to lose them within 2 years. And so you really have to ask yourself, do you want to keep that level of churn in your organization, have to manage it? And in my experience, it just wasn't as helpful if that's not the company secret sauce. My 2 cents. Thanks.
I love it, guys. And so, you know, for all of you folks that are on right now, we have a couple of you on. Feel free to post your questions in the chat. We're going to get to those right now. We're at the live Q&A portion, and we have one from Chris Bell. So talk about zero trust solutions. So who wants to take that? I'll let you guys go. Anyone wants to take that question from Chris? Not all at one time.
As we all scramble. All right.
So does that mean that we don't trust the solution, or we don't trust our network? No,
yeah, seriously. So, I mean, there are a couple of things that could be alluding to, but I'm going to go with what I think is probably the answer and actually tie it to a relevant example. So the recent Microsoft Exchange exploit is potentially traced back to a combination of, they don't know this for sure, but it sounds like it might be insider threat There could have been some code that leaked from a Microsoft partner. So short version is exploits today are getting so complex and so complicated that the previous approach of just making sure you had a strong perimeter and the right antivirus and the right malware tools, that used to do a pretty good job of keeping you secure. And today that simply is not the way that it works anymore. You can have the best antivirus, you can have a combination of malware tools and clients on your machine, monitoring everything that happens live. And because of the sophistication of some of these bad actors, because it sometimes comes from IP and code leaked from the platform itself that's going to be compromised, is the vulnerability and the exploit can happen in some cases weeks and months before these are parceled up into a recognizable piece of code that malware is going to protect you from, that an anti-malware tool will protect you from. Yeah. So a real shift in the security approach has been really twofold. It used to be build your walls strong and thick and tall and nobody's going to get in. That's not the approach anymore. It's make sure you've got the right intel to know what is happening on your network so you can identify things as they happen. And the other change in approach is zero trust means you are operating from a default position of you do not trust anything. It's not leave your network open except for the things you say are okay. It's leave your network closed except for the things that you specifically permit. And taking that zero trust approach to not only your network and your ports and your firewalls, but taking the zero trust approach to what applications are you going to permit to operate inside your network? How are you going to restrict what can communicate between your LAN and your WAN and your DMZ? And just adopting the zero trust mindset is becoming more embraced, along with a whole set of layers of security to help protect you today. Craig, I know you've got some relevant experience when it comes to zero trust. Thoughts on that one?
Yeah, and denying everything by default, right, is certainly a secure method. It's just in practice, in application, it requires a little bit of TLC, right? So you need those resources, you need the bandwidth, and you need the cycles to actually monitor those things. Getting back to what we talked about earlier about security being a business enabler rather than a stopper, right? You need the ability to actually grant exceptions to some of your security measures, right? And Lee said it, Lee used the perfect example, right? The most secure computer is the one that's disconnected and unplugged, but that you can't get any business done there. You will run into things that need the exception to the zero trust, right? That's what the model's based on. And you need the cycles and you need the ability to quickly pivot a little bit and allow in a controlled manner the exceptions to that process. So is it great in theory? Absolutely. Is it almost the standard now in terms of security theory? Certainly it is. And it's what Jeff and I recommend when we go out and assess security controls. However, you do have to be ready. The ability to grant exceptions for those things in a manner that you can granularly control and cut off, for a limited amount of time. But yeah.
Interesting. Well, I think that was an interesting question. And it seems like a lot of our questions you're going to see coming up next are based around the zero trust. And it seems to be a big buzzword. Matter of fact, let me show you this. Leek, if you could take this question, because we kind of touched on it earlier on in the hour, from Robert Henderson. Has the security field made it too complex for people to execute on their purpose? Too many tools, too many frameworks, competing priorities, et cetera. We kind of touched on that, alluded to it a little bit earlier. But can you elaborate for Robert?
That's a great question. I mean, there definitely are a lot of frameworks, definitely a lot of tools, and there's definitely a lot of business purposes to execute. So for me, there's a lot of value with sitting down with the right people and within the business to say, what is going to be our framework? And once we know what our framework is, then drive to it. There are ways to go through and even map all these overlapping frameworks into one framework, whether you're looking at high trust, to go through and to map it all into one mother of all frameworks. You can do that. And from a tooling purpose, I'd encourage you to take a decided approach instead of going through and just buying the tool du jour, making sure that you know what your business problem is that you're trying to solve, that security problem you're trying to solve. Make sure it aligns with the controls and the framework, and then do the right thing there. And also that dynamic that these other two guys will probably speak to more eloquently is that idea of, do you need to be best of breed, or will a suite be good enough for what you need to do? And I'm cautious about using that terminology, good enough, because it has certain baggage. But definitely make sure you're getting the right solution for your company, the amount of people you have, the amount of resources you have, so that you can manage that tool and actually use it. I do not like walking into an organization where they have 5 different tools that do the exact same thing. And it's very frustrating, because it's a lot of lost capital, and it's an indicator that the IT team has not done everything as well as they could have done, which sometimes leads back to some business challenges. I'll leave it at that. So definitely agree that it is complicated, and that's part of our job as security, is to make the complicated simple. And I'll be real, another caveat there on the word simple. I hate using the word simple to the executive team. What we do is very straightforward, but it's never simple. So yes, it's no longer simple. It never was simple from an IT perspective. It is complicated, but our job is to make it as straightforward as possible. Give the executive team something that they can understand the storyline, buy into the storyline, be committed to the storyline, and be able to execute on it. And if we can do that consistently, then we'll win. I
love it. Anyone else want to add to that, Jeff or Craig?
Yeah, just humor is always good, right? So I have a quick bit I would typically use anytime I'm sat in front of the CEO talking about, okay, we need to spend this much and here's why. And you'd identify, here's a solution that you want. And we'd always talk about the security triangle, right? So here's what we recommend. It can be cheap, it can be easy to use, it can work. Pick 2.
Love it.
Get it? If it's cheap, if you want it cheap and easy to use, it's not going to work. If you want it to work and cheap, it's not going to be easy to use. And it's a joke, but frankly, it's legit. And Robert's question asking about, has it become too complex? You do, to Lee's point, you have to come back to, why is this required, right? Why do these frameworks exist? Why in many cases now are companies and certainly government mandating that businesses comply with these sets of regulations? It's historically as a result of years of underinvestment in basic cyber hygiene. That's why companies are losing their IP. That's why companies are getting infiltrated. That's why, you don't hear about the companies that went into business because Chinese hackers stole their data, and now there's a cheaper, more competitive product on the market that the American company can't sell anymore. This is enough of an issue that in many cases, this is not necessarily by choice that people adopt this best practice. It's because they need to do it to survive and to stay in business. Unfortunately, as this threat landscape evolves, sometimes the complexity of the tools need to evolve right along with the threats in order to keep protecting our data.
I love it. And Craig, I want to tee this question up for you because we're coming up here on the hour. So I want to make sure we get as many questions in as we can. This came from Raj Kapoor, so I'm going to ask it for him. He has a quick question. What is the best way or best practices to minimize shadow IT from occurring in your organization?
Yeah, man, time flies when you're having fun, right, Jonathan? So shadow IT, right? Every deployment we go out on, every client we walk through the door, there's shadow IT out there, right? If it's just Joe that knows a little bit, that's setting up the printers on the network that, without permission, it is out there and it's very real, right? Shadow IT is everywhere. The 2 things you need to kind of combat shadow IT. The most important is buy-in from your C-suite, right? And this goes to one of the tricky parts about security is the better we do our job, the less noticed we are, right? It's like the Y2K thing. Everybody prepped for Y2K and there wasn't a disaster. So now afterwards people ask, well, did we really need to do all that? Sure, without the preparation, Y2K would have been tough. With security, the more you do, the better you do it, the less noticeable you are, right? So you need to make sure your SOC and your security folk are collecting those data points that you can present to the C-suite and you can prove your ROI, right? It's tough to show ROI with security that's really working because no bad things are happening, right? And people start to think, well, if no bad things are happening, first thing we can get rid of is security. So buy-in from the C-suite is developed upon that, right? You've got to initiate and create a relationship with the C-suite, and you need buy-in from them to combat the shadow IT. And that's not just, fighting shadow IT. That is establishing a very real and well-designed IT function and IT security function that has the support of all the way up through, the board if need be, right? So when you start to limit, admin rights for the developers, right? You'll run into that every company you go to, right? Software developers need admin rights because we're going to run, newly designed software, pieces of software. That's problematic. There's ways that you can do that in a controlled manner, and people hold their administrative rights very dear. Their people's admin rights are very dear to them, and they don't want to give them up. But with them, it's just an untenable security risk, right? So you're going to need a little bit of backup from the higher ups on that, and you're going to need, the other thing you're going to need is very specific policies and procedures, right? If you can't point to something that's been approved and is the governing policy of your company that says thou shalt not plug that extra printer into the network without approval or from a certain vendor or with a certain baseline or hardened characteristics to it, it's tough to enforce that. So the short answer I would say is two things, right? You need buy-in, you need the support, and you need that anyway. And you need specific examples that you need a guidebook, you need a policy that people can point to and say, hey, don't do that. That's wrong.
Awesome. Well, guys, look, we got 2 more questions. So really quickly, because we're coming up on the hour, let me ask this question from Chris. He has another question there. MDR versus, I don't even know your advice. I'm not technical, guys. So you guys whoever wants to take it, take it.
Yeah. So I can't say enough about SIMs, right? They put everything in one place, and it's what you need to touch on. Whether you go inside, right, to touch back to the previous question we had, inside or outside, outhouse SOC, right? You're going to need a SIM. You're going to need to point to the events that are happening. Quite frankly, those are requirements in any framework you're going to decide to use. You've got to use it, and you've got to get in there, and you've got to make sure all of your data points are flowing into it. It's one of the toughest things you'll do, but once you're doing it, it makes everything else so much easier. It's an initial investment and a tough effort, but once you're doing it, it's a force multiplier, really.
I didn't even know what the hell that was. I tell you, I don't even know what SIM is. I'm not technical.
In event management, it's a tool that collects all of the logs from your security tools and basically does some real-time AI analytics. Hey, because we see this from the firewall and we see this over here from one of your perimeter switches, we think there's some weirdness going on in your network. So it collects all of your intelligence and helps you analyze what's actually happening and preemptively can point out threats. I can give you a very relevant example. I'm sorry I keep coming back to the Microsoft Exchange hack, but it's probably the biggest vulnerability out there right now that the most companies have been affected by. We are working with a couple of clients that basically had zero impact. They actually were running versions of Exchange that had those vulnerabilities, but they were not impacted because the SIM that they were using actually flagged, hey, this is a threat, you need to deal with this. And without naming specific tools, having a good SIM can absolutely make the difference between you're going to get impacted and lose data and infiltrated, or you're not. So to Craig's point, I concur completely. Big fan of SIMs. The biggest problem we see in many companies we work with is they just don't have one, and that's one of the first things we try to fix.
Love it. All right, guys. And our last question here, whoever wants to take it, is which is the best recommendation to identify zero-day vulnerabilities, threat intelligence, and vulnerability management solutions? Anything more? Which more practice do you recommend? Lee, I see you shaking your head there, chomping at the bit. You want to take that one?
There's definitely different ways to do it. And to me, it goes back to where are you at in your maturity curve. So whether it's SIM versus MDR, if you're low on your maturity curve, go for the SIM first. That's a foundational. Once you build your foundation, then grow into MDR. If you're going to go through with this threat intelligence versus vulnerability management, start with vulnerability management. Know where your problems are, be able to fix them, and then layer on the threat intelligence to move faster. Just however fast you want to move is how much more tool set you add in. Start with blocking and tagging. Start with the basics and then build from there. Go ahead.
Anyone else want to add to that as we wind down here?
Just a tip that we always try to throw in. It seems like bringing everything back to the basics, but again, super simple. Do your backups. Back up your data. Test your backups. You know, if you have a properly configured backup solution that you know is working, you basically don't have to care about ransomware. I mean, you do. But if you, heaven forbid, get a ransomware attack and you're confident enough in your backups that you're simply restoring data that you know is good, it's not a big deal. Back up your data. And to all the C-level CEOs and the CFOs and the VPs, just because you think that, oh yeah, our team, our backups are good. Are they? When's the last time they were tested? When's the last time they didn't just say, oh yeah, they're good? When's the last time you poked and said, prove it, show me that they work? That is the one single biggest thing that frankly would prevent most companies from needing our services. So, you know, we're happy to help you when something bad happens, but it's so easy to avoid something bad from happening. Just do it.
Love it. Well, you know what, guys? I want to thank you. We're past the hour here. We went a little bit over, but we had some engagement from the audience. So I wanted to make sure we got to as many questions as possible. So I want to thank the audience for joining us on LinkedIn and YouTube. I want to thank Craig. I want to thank Lee. I want to thank Jeff. I really appreciate you guys adding value to not only my network, but everyone in everyone else's network here, that we're all connected, because this is something that this is a topic that we have to keep front of mind, not only for the IT practitioners that I'm connected to and we're connected to, but also the employees as well. So thank you guys very much. If you three don't mind just staying on just for a quick second as we wind down here, I really appreciate that. So everyone, thank you very much. If you missed the live, you're probably watching this as a previously recorded live. So if you have any questions that we didn't touch on this hour and you want to ask, just join the chat in LinkedIn or private message me, and I can get those answers for you by asking these guys directly. So I want to thank everyone very, very much for jumping on here. Just One Byte. This was a one-time only event with these three guys. So really appreciate everyone hopping on. Have a great rest of your day. Stay safe. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.